What happens when America's most loyal ally decides that loyalty no longer pays? For decades, Australia has stood shoulder to shoulder with Washington, from military campaigns in the Middle East to the Pacific strategy meant to contain China. But now, behind the polished doors of Canberra's parliament and inside the buzzing corridors of Sydney's business towers, a new conversation is unfolding. One that would have seemed impossible only a few years ago. Australia is quietly weighing the unthinkable, walking away from the U.S. orbit and embracing BRICS, the economic bloc led by China, Russia, India, and others. This isn't just talk on the fringes. It's being reported by the Financial Times, The Guardian, and even Politico. Diplomats whisper that Chinese banks are making billion-dollar promises. Business groups are furious over U.S. tariffs. And Australia's government is split down the middle. If this choice is made, it would shake the very foundation of the Western alliance. So how did we get here? And why does it matter so much? Let's dive deep into the drama, because the story of Australia's possible shift to BRICS isn't just about trade. It's about the collapse of American trust, the rise of Chinese influence, and the future of global power.
The first cracks appeared not in politics, but in economics. For decades, Australia exported its lifeblood, iron ore, aluminum, and agricultural goods, to both the United States and Asia. But when Donald Trump returned to the White House with a promise of America first, Australia quickly discovered what that really meant. Tariffs, tariffs, and more tariffs. New restrictions slapped on Australian aluminum and steel blindsided Canberra. Farmers who had once relied on U.S. buyers suddenly found their products priced out of the market. The Australian Aluminium Council issued a rare, urgent statement, warning that Trump's policies threatened thousands of jobs and undermined decades of partnership. Inside government, the mood turned sour. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese found himself caught between two camps. On one side, traditionalists insisted Australia must remain loyal to Washington, no matter the cost. On the other, a growing chorus of ministers argued that the country could no longer afford to be chained to an unreliable partner. This wasn't just about economics. It was about respect. And when Trump bluntly declared on Fox News that America would no longer babysit its allies, many in Canberra took it as a slap in the face. For the first time in decades, Australia began seriously asking, what if there's another way? While Washington wielded sticks, Beijing offered carrots, big ones. Chinese diplomats stepped up their presence in Canberra, quietly promising deals that were hard to ignore. Trade concessions, investment guarantees, billions in infrastructure projects, secret meetings between Chinese state banks and Australia's largest financial institutions in Sydney and Melbourne began appearing in the press. Plans for green energy plants, high-speed rail, and expanded port facilities were whispered about in boardrooms. Beijing's pitch was simple. Why struggle under Washington's tariffs when you could thrive in BRICS? This wasn't hard pressure. It was a seduction, subtle, patient, and framed as partnership for the future. Beijing positioned itself not as a master, but as a collaborator. And Australia's export-driven economy was listening. After all, over 35% of Australia's exports already went to China. Iron ore, coal, beef, wine. China was already their biggest customer. Now, China offered to buy even more, at better rates, locking in long-term contracts that the United States could never match. For many in Canberra, the choice began to feel less like betrayal
and more like common sense. And as Beijing extended its hand, Australia's grip on Washington began to loosen. Panic set in across Washington. Reports in the Washington Post described emergency meetings inside the White House. Advisors scrambled to draft military and diplomatic counteroffers, hoping to bind Australia closer to the U.S. through defense agreements under the AUKUS alliance. But the problem was deeper than military guarantees. In Canberra, senior defense officials asked a chilling question in closed-door hearings. If the U.S. goes to war with China tomorrow, does Australia automatically become a target? This was no longer theoretical. With tensions in the South China Sea rising, Australian officers knew their bases could be the first struck in any conflict. Suddenly, Washington's promises of protection looked like liabilities. America wanted Australia on the front line, but Australia was asking whether it wanted to be there at all. Meanwhile, Trump doubled down on his tariff policies, insisting allies must pay their share or face consequences. For Australians, it was insult on top of injury. They were paying with lost jobs, crippled exports, and the threat of becoming collateral in a U.S.-China showdown. The more America pushed, the more Australia pulled back, and China was waiting with open arms. If politics was divided, business was not. Corporate Australia made its position clear. U.S. tariffs were a disaster, and China was the lifeline. The Aluminium Council, agricultural unions, and mining giants all began lobbying openly for diversification. Code for deepening ties with Beijing. Executives warned that clinging to Washington would cost billions and leave Australia isolated in its own region. At the same time, Chinese media in English flooded Australian airwaves and websites, painting the country not as a junior partner of the U.S., but as an independent power with the potential to lead the Southern Pacific. Slowly, this narrative began to take hold. Ordinary Australians, tired of feeling like pawns in Washington's tariff wars, started asking whether BRICS membership might actually protect their jobs and open new opportunities. Polling hinted at a slow but steady shift in public opinion, especially among younger voters who saw Asia, not America, as the future. In the boardrooms of Sydney and Melbourne, the decision was already being made. Follow the money, follow the future. And all signs pointed east. One surprising player cheering from the sidelines was India. Despite a complicated past with Australia, clashes over trade, immigration, and even cricket, New Delhi saw opportunity. According to The Hindu, Indian officials quietly backed Australia's entry into BRICS. Why? Because it would strengthen the bloc's southern flank and give India leverage as a mediator between Beijing and Canberra. For India, this wasn't just about economics, it was about rewriting the global order. If Australia joined, BRICS would no longer be seen merely as a club of developing nations. It would gain a Western democracy with a strong economy, advanced industries, and critical resources. India wanted to be the bridge that made it happen. Behind closed doors, Indian diplomats suggested joint projects in energy and technology. The message was clear. We may have had differences, but inside BRICS, we can shape the future together. This unexpected alignment gave Australia even more reason to consider the move. Joining BRICS wouldn't mean surrendering to China. It could mean balancing between giants, with India as an ally inside the club. Suddenly, what once looked like betrayal now looked like strategy. The alarms in Washington grew louder. Analysts at the Rand Corporation warned that losing Australia would collapse America's Indo-Pacific strategy. Without Australian bases, surveillance posts, and naval support, the U.S. would face a massive hole in its Pacific defense network. The Wall Street Journal reported that the National Security Council was drafting scenarios for a partial loss of Australia. The language was chilling. If Australia flipped, others could follow. New Zealand, the Philippines, even South Korea might begin to question American reliability. What began as a trade dispute over tariffs was snowballing into a potential unraveling of the entire U.S. alliance system, a house of cards, ready to topple. For decades, the United States had assumed allies would remain loyal no matter what. But Trump's tariffs, insults, and transactional approach to diplomacy shattered that assumption. Now, Washington was waking up to the nightmare. America's closest friends were no longer afraid to walk away. And if Australia led the charge, the consequences would be catastrophic for U.S. influence worldwide. Analysts began using a powerful metaphor: Australia as the Trojan horse. If it joined BRICS, it would carry Western credibility into a bloc that had always been seen as an outsider club. With Australia inside, BRICS would instantly shed the label of developing world. It would become a true global alternative, an economic and political counterweight to the US-led order. For Beijing, this was the ultimate prize. Not through war, not through coercion, but through investment, trade, and quiet diplomacy. A democratic Western nation joining BRICS would legitimize China's vision of a new world order. For Washington, it would be a humiliation like no other, a betrayal, not just by an ally, but by an ally it had long taken for granted. And once the Trojan horse was inside the gates, the entire architecture of U.S. dominance could collapse. Australia's choice wasn't final, but the symbolism was clear. The world was changing, and the old alliances no longer guaranteed the future. So where does this leave us? Australia is at a crossroads, pulled between its historic loyalty to Washington and the irresistible pull of Beijing's promises. Tariffs have backfired. Military guarantees no longer look safe. Business, public opinion, and even strategic rivals like India are aligning toward BRICS. For the United States, the message is devastating. Loyalty can't be commanded, only earned. And right now, America's most loyal allies are questioning whether Washington is worth the cost. If Australia does take the leap, it won't just be about trade or economics. It will be about the collapse of an era, the end of unquestioned U.S. dominance in the Pacific, and the birth of a truly multipolar world. And that's the haunting question we leave you with. If even America's closest friends no longer trust it, how long before the entire order collapses?